1923, Eric Liddell was the fastest Scotsman. And as the 1924 Olympic Games were drawing close in Paris, France, everyone had high hopes of what he would do in his main event, the 100-meter race. Until he discovered that the heats for his event were going to be held on a Sunday. And so he, as the son of missionaries to China and as a devout believer in Christ, looking at serving the Lord overseas as a missionary, he notified the British Olympic Committee and said, I cannot run on Sunday. It's the Sabbath. And so the Olympic Committee, they were aghast at his decision. They couldn't understand it. They thought that he was misguided by his religious fanaticism. And so they came to him and tried to persuade him to change his mind. And they used the argument of, well, you can worship God in the morning and still run in the afternoon. After all, in the continental Europe, the continental Sabbath is like that. You can worship in the morning and still run. To which Eric Liddell said, well, I can't do that because for me, the Sabbath is the entire day. It's not just the morning. And so all of Scotland, when they learned this, they were also aghast. They were dumbfounded. They were like, what is he thinking? And this is the thing as believers. When God has called us to follow Him, and we choose to make a stand because of our convictions in the Lord, the world looks at us and they don't fully understand us. They respond in different ways. They may come to us and try to persuade us to change our minds. They may apply pressure, public pressure on social media to try to shame us and cause us to change our behavior. They may take steps to make it extremely painful for us, showing us just what the cost of following Christ can be like if we persist. And they may even choose to reject us and to isolate us and to allow us to hopefully wither away. And this is the issue that we face every day as a follower of Jesus Christ. Am I willing to stand firm on convictions of what I see in the Word of God? Or instead, am I going to choose to compromise because of the high cost of obeying God? When we come to Daniel chapter 1, this is essentially the issue that Daniel is confronted with in this chapter. And this is what we're going to examine the next several weeks as we begin a new series on the high cost of obedience to Christ and the consequences. But just some context, look with me in chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. The writer gives us some background information here. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. And so what's happening is this. By this point in the history of Israel, the king of Judah is in its twilight years. They had been disobedient to God, rebelling against Him, following after other idols. And so he has already allowed to experience his judgment, but now it's about to get compressed as they face the last 20 years or so of their existence as a nation. And so what happens here is King Josiah, the last good king of the nation, has died in battle as he tried to prevent Pharaoh Necho from going to Carchemish to stop the Babylonians from advancing. King Josiah dies, his son Jehoahaz assumes the throne. Pharaoh Necho goes to Carchemish, faces defeat, comes back, takes out his revenge upon the king of Judah, takes Jehoahaz as his hostage, and makes his brother Jehoiakim king. Around 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar comes through on a campaign to subdue and capture Egypt, and he besieges Jerusalem, captures it, takes a lot of the articles that were used in the temple worship back to Babylonia, and he makes Jehoiakim his vassal, meaning that Jehoiakim has to pay tribute to him. And so for 3 years, he's a loyal vassal, and then he finally says, no more. And so at that time, Nebuchadnezzar became the sole power, the sole king of that. Before that, he was co-regent with his dad. So he's trying to secure his own position, and so he allowed other people groups to try to bring Jehoiakim to heel as a vassal, and all that failed. He now comes. So by 597, 598 BC, he besieges Jerusalem again. King Jehoiakim dies. His son Jehoiachin assumes the throne, and Jehoiachin does the wise thing. He surrenders. Rather than letting the people suffer, he surrenders. And so Jehoiachin, his mother, his harem, his wives, a lot of the nobility, a lot of court officials, leaders of the nation, the whole army of 7,000 men, 1,000 craftsmen, artisans are all deported to Babylonia. And among them are Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so this is where this story begins. And the first thing that we see in verses 3 through 7 is this, that culture will do its best to influence the believer to abandon God and to conform to its way of thinking. So put yourself in Daniel's position. All of these young men, they have just seen Jerusalem captured. Their spiritual hope that God would somehow intervene has been in vain. They've been uprooted from everything that they know and taken to a new land, new place, new foods, things that are unfamiliar with them, and so they're already emotionally distraught, disoriented. And Nebuchadnezzar comes, and he's already established an academy, a training academy for young men, 14 to 15, to go through the process of being educated so that they might serve him in some capacity after 3 years. And so he orders Ashpenaz, one of the chief officials, to say, pick some of these choice young Jewish men. Men who are handsome, men who are physically perfect in every way, no birth defect, no illness, no injury. Men who are cultured, they know how to act around a king. They're well informed of the world, and they're quick, they have an aptitude for learning. Take these men, and you're going to start training them our language, Sumerian, Akkadian, Aramaic. And you're going to teach them our literature and our religious beliefs and our mythology. And so, for these young Jewish men, consider this. Up to now, they're captives. There is no hope. There is no future for them. And so they're selected for something different. And we can just imagine for them the thought process of, wow, maybe this is how God can use me to influence the king. What harm can it be to learn from them? And so it's a very intentional aspect and strategy that Nebuchadnezzar uses. There's a practical purpose behind it that is very seductive, that persuades us that maybe this is okay. But if you look at verses 5, 6, and 7, we see that it's very comprehensive. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. The chief official gave them new names to Daniel, the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, to Azariah, Abednego. And so in what ways are comprehensive? He says, I don't just want them to be taught the language and the literature. I want them to essentially lose their sense of Jewish identity. This idea that they are somehow unique and different from the rest of us, so that they are just like everyone else. And so we're going to start with the foods that they eat. We're going to give them the same foods that I as the king eat. What would those foods be? It would be different vegetables like beets and peas, arugula, lettuce, turnips, legumes like chickpeas and mushrooms. They season it with onions and scallions and garlic and leeks. They eat grains such as barley and oats, fruits, apples, figs, pomegranates, plums, and different meats such as beef, mutton, pork, venison, chickens and other birds, eggs, fish, shellfish, and turtle. And there would be other types of stews, meat stews, and vegetable stews that could appear on the table. So already you can see there's a problem with this, because as a Jewish man or woman, you know that diet is very important. You're prohibited from eating pork. You're prohibited from eating shellfish. These are all different foods and wine that could have been offered to an idol before being presented for food to eat. And so he's trying to change who they are. And it goes more than just a diet. Look at what he does. He gives them new names. Daniel, his name means God is my judge. He's given the name Belteshazzar, which means may Bel protect his life. Bel is one of the Babylonian main gods. Hananiah, the grace of the Lord, was given the name Shadrach, command of Aku. Aku is another main Babylonian god. Mishael, who is what God is, he's given the name Meshach. Meshach is a hard one to translate, so it possibly could mean something like, who is what Aku is. And Azariah, the Lord is my help, was given the name Abednego, servant of Nebo, another Babylonian god, or servant of the Shining One. And so what's he doing? He's giving them new names, because the name is your identity. And every time they're being called this new name, they're being reminded that they're serving a different God. Because in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, in that culture, when you conquer another people group, it's showing that your gods are greater than that people, conquered people's gods. So in his mind, the gods of Bel and Nebo and Aku are greater than God himself, because he conquered Israel. He conquered Judah. And so for these young Jewish men who are now in this new identity, it's very persuasive to begin to consider that maybe, just maybe, God is not who he says he is. And this is the seductive thing about culture, is it seeks to transform every aspect of our life so that we are fully assimilated. I'm a Star Trek fan. Not really of the original series, but more of the Next Generation. And in the Next Generation, with Captain Picard, Commander Riker, Commander Data, all of them, there was a villain that's introduced at the end of Season 3, the Borg. And the Borg is a cybernetic race. They assimilate every different alien race, and no one can resist them. And so their T line is this: we are Borg, prepare to be assimilated, resistance is futile. And so for these young Jewish men in this training program, where they're going to be in for 3 years, it's very futile to resist. And this is the thing: when someone comes to our country and they want to become a citizen, they have to assimilate. They have to learn our history. They have to learn our language. And in doing so, they begin to learn our values. And then they take the citizenship test, which, frankly, for many of us, we probably wouldn't be able to answer it. I've seen some of those questions. I'm not sure what the answer is. But they do it so this way they understand, what does it mean to be a citizen of the United States of America? Or take another step. I know Charlie has served in the Marines. I'm sure he remembers what it was like to be at boot camp. You can see YouTube videos of what it's like. But essentially, the first day you get off that bus, you got a drill sergeant yelling in your face, you got to line up on yellow painted footprints. They're making you do different things. You have to respond, yes sir, no sir, as loudly as you can. It's disorienting. Then they tell you to follow an officer one by one in your rows to go inside for processing, and there you have to stand, and you've got desks, you have to empty out your pockets, all your personal things. They give you an absurd small amount of time to do everything. And when you do it wrong, they yell in your face. If you don't respond correctly, they yell in your face. If you don't respond loudly enough, they yell in your face. Then after you go through that, then you go through processing where you get your inoculations, you get your uniforms, and it's more yelling. Then it becomes a blur of training for 13 weeks, of learning how to make your bed the proper way, showering, brushing your teeth, eating, going from task to task, an absurd limited amount of time they didn't think was humanly possible. Why do they do this? So in all this process, they're breaking down the individual, begin to teach them what it means to be a U.S. Marine. What's the values? What's the history? What's the ethos of being a Marine? What are all the ranks? How do you shoot the gun the proper way? How do you do combat training the right way? So that when you come out after boot camp, you have the skills necessary to work in a team. So that, everyone else that you're going to be stationed with, they went through the same training. You can work as a team. There's a common language. There's a common cultural understanding. There's common values, common way of how you view the world. But yet, when you look here in our country, we see this, and we see another type of cultural I don't want to say program, but another cultural mindset starting to take place. One that is Marxist and socialist in its outlook when it looks at economy, at the financial side and history. One that looks at people in terms of their gender identity or their racial background, and you start judging people solely by that. You begin to see this cultivated in our political process, our educational system. You begin to see different morals coming out and belief systems. And what is it doing? It's calling us to submit to it. And so this is what culture does. It's trying to influence us as the church to abandon God and to conform to it. It's like being a frog in the kettle of boiling water. You put the frog in a pot of water that is room temperature. It's going to stay there. It's not going to jump out. It feels comfortable. Then you slowly turn on the heat. And you just let the temperature start rising slowly. And that frog's going to just stay there until the water's boiling and it cooks to death. That's what our culture is wanting us to do, is to be so comfortable that we get sucked into it without realizing what's happening. But look here in chapter 1 of Daniel, verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. The believer is confronted with a daily choice, and the danger of compromise is not always clear. This thing, Daniel says, I am not going to defile myself this way. But the other young men in this program, look with me in verse 15. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. All the other young men, they said, it's okay to eat this food. No one's going to know. Mom and Dad aren't here. The priest, the synagogue leader, they're not here. No one really knows. It's okay for me to eat something. It's okay for me to eat some shellfish. In fact, you know what? It's great. Bacon is awesome. But the problem is this. Once we begin to compromise in the little things, we start going down a slippery slope of compromising more and more. Because think of it this way, for these young men. So they eat these foods. They're learning this literature. At some point they're going to say, you know what, part of your duties as a court official is you have to participate in religious ceremonies. And so you have to go to these temples, to these idols, and you've got to worship. Well, this is just a matter between me and God. He knows my heart is not really into it. I just have to do it for the job. It's okay. And so you start doing things. But over time, you become desensitized to your sin, and you start going further and further. This is the danger of compromise. And for all of us, we're confronted with a situation where we can compromise, we face the same danger. Compromise in one place leads to another, until eventually we look no different than the culture around us. We see different examples here in history. The church in Germany in the 1930s, Adolf Hitler becomes chancellor. He begins to vent against the Jewish people. He begins to coerce the Lutheran Church in Germany to participate in his programs. They see Hitler as a Messiah figure saving the German race. And they're slowly sucked into the Nazi ideology. In fact, the head over the Lutheran Church is a Nazi official. And they begin to place pastors who follow the Nazi ideology into place to preach and minister to people. So as political opponents are taken into captivity, into concentration camps, as homosexuals are taken into concentration camps, as socialists are taken into concentration camps, as Jewish people are taken into concentration camps, no one bats an eye. Why? Because they have already compromised, they've gone down that road. But the danger of remaining faithful to our convictions is also clear. Because look here again. Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He recognized there's a danger here of eating the food that is from the king's table. Leviticus 11, if you want to turn there with me, is the chapter on the foods that were clean and the foods that were unclean, what they were permitted to eat. Verse 4, there are some that only chew the cud, or only have a split hoof. Or let me take a step back. Verse 2, of all the animals that live on land, these are the ones you may eat. You may eat any animal that has a split hoof completely divided, and that chews the cud. There are some that only chew the cud, or only have a split hoof, but you must not eat them. The camel, though it chews the cud, does not have a split hoof. It is ceremonially unclean for you. The coney, though it chews the cud, does not have a split hoof. It is unclean for you. The rabbit, though it chews the cud, does not have a split hoof. It is unclean for you. And the pig, though it has a split hoof, completely divided, does not chew the cud. It is unclean for you. You must not eat their meat or touch their carcasses. They are unclean for you. Of all the creatures living in the water of the seas and the streams, you may eat any that have fins and scales. But all the creatures in the seas or streams that do not have fins and scales, whether among all the swarming things or among all the other living creatures in the water, you are to detest. And since you are to detest them, you must not eat their meat, and you must detest their carcasses. And living in the water that does not have fins and scales is to be detestable to you. And so Daniel knows this. And he knows that the foods that he's going to encounter are going to be these prohibited foods. And so he says, I can't change what I'm learning. I can't change the clothes I need to wear. But the one thing I have in my power and control is the foods I can eat. This is his conviction. This is how he's going to maintain his identity as a member of God's chosen people. But there's also a danger to that. And the chief official brings this up. If you look in verse 10 with me. I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned you food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? His fear was that Daniel and his friends would look weak and sickly. What does that mean? He's afraid that if they ate only vegetables, if they didn't eat the food that came from the king's table, they would be thin. And that culture, being thin, was seen as a sign of being unwell and ill, weak. And so if this is what Daniel looks like, then there's a cost. Daniel could be kicked out at the bare minimum. The king could say, I can't believe you would rebel against me in this way, so I'm going to kill you. And so there's a costliness to maintain our convictions. For us who follow after Jesus Christ, what's the cost? It could be legal if we maintain our convictions. In Colorado, there's a baker, Jack Phillips, Masterpiece Cake Shop. Several years ago, back in 2017, someone called him up and said, hey, me and my partner, same-sex partner, we're getting married. Can you make a wedding cake for us? And Jack Phillips, as a believer, said, I can't do that. That's my personal conviction. That's my religious beliefs. I cannot celebrate this, but what I can do is I can provide you with an alternative. I can sell you a cake, pre-made cake, and then you guys can decorate however you want. Or I can refer you to another baker who can help you. But they didn't want another baker, and so they filed a complaint with the appropriate office in Colorado that then levied fines on Masterpiece Cake Shop. And then this went to the Supreme Court, where they said that the state of Colorado had infringed on his freedom of religion. And that same day they made the ruling, another activist calls up Jack Phillips and says, hey, can you make me a cake? On the inside, make it blue. On the outside, have pink icing. It's a gender transition celebration party. Jack Phillips probably says, I can't do this. I can't celebrate this because of my religious beliefs. And so we go down the same road again. There's a legal cost to it. It could be financial. It could be vocational, where you could lose your job. And it could be physical, where someone could be beaten or killed. So there's a costliness to taking a stand. That's the dilemma that we have. That's the choice we have to make. But look with me in verses 9 through 14. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. And the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your service for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to do this and test them for 10 days. So if we say, God, I want to honor you, and I want to maintain my convictions and take this stand, and I recognize the costliness, then what happens, we are essentially living by faith, demonstrating our faith through our obedience and trusting for God to show mercy. And the first thing we see in this story is how God causes Daniel to find favor with the chief official. This is just like the story of Joseph. Remember that story? Joseph was 11 of 12 sons, the favorite of his dad. His brothers hated him, one, because he was the favorite son, two, because he ratted them out for whatever they were doing that they didn't do properly before their dad. And so he also angered them with two dreams, saying, hey, I had this dream. We were out in the fields gleaning the wheat, and we were tying them together as sheaves, and all your sheaves bowed down to mine. Then I had another dream where there was a sun and the moon and 12 stars, and the 11 stars, the sun and the day all bowed down to me. And the brothers understood what he was saying, that, hey, you guys are going to bow down to me. They hated him. And so one day his dad sends his brothers to care for the sheep. They go to a place, and then his dad got worried, sent Joseph to look for them in Shechem. And he's wandering around, and someone says, hey, who are you looking for? And he said, I'm looking for my brothers. And he says, oh, they're over at Dothan. So along comes Joseph. He's wearing a robe that's brightly colored. They recognize him from distance. They say, here's that dreamer, let's kill him. And Reuben, because he's messed up with his dad, wanting to get his dad's good graces, says, no, let's put him in the cistern, because his goal was to, at an opportune time, rescue Joseph from there, bring him back to his dad and say, this is what happened. So they throw him in this cistern. Joseph is distraught. For whatever reason, Reuben disappears from the story for a brief moment. And their other brothers sitting down for lunch. Along comes this caravan of Midianites going to Egypt. And Judah says, hey, I've got a better idea. Let's go sell Joseph into slavery so we'll never see him again. And so they do that. Joseph ends up in Egypt. Genesis 39. He's sold as a slave to Potiphar. Potiphar is the captain of Pharaoh's guard. He's in charge of the prison. And so he serves as a servant. And God is with Joseph, and he finds favor with Potiphar, so that whatever Joseph does, Potiphar sees that he does it well, and Potiphar is prospering because of it. So he entrusts everything to Joseph. The only thing that he concerns himself with is, what does he eat every day? And the well-being of his wife. But his wife takes notice of Joseph. She lusts after him. She invites him to enter into an adulterous affair with her. He refuses. This goes on day after day after day until finally one day there's no one around. It's just him and her. She grabs his cloak, tries to force him down in bed. He escapes, leaves his cloak in her hand, so she's then turns around as a scorned woman and starts falsely accusing him of trying to rape her. Her husband comes home. She tells the story of, this is what your Hebrew slave tried to do to me. Potiphar is so mad, he throws Joseph into the prison that he's in charge of. And there God is still with Joseph, and Joseph finds favor with the warden, where he's now given free rein to go everywhere in the prison to check on the well-being of the other prisoners. We see this. God shows favor. God acts in this way for those who are obedient and faithful to him. But this is the thing. The significance of God's role means that we should seek it out in prayer. I'll give a quick example, and then we'll look at Nehemiah chapter 1. When Debbie and I were at Highview, we were both singles. I was teaching a single Sunday school class, and she was one of the people in my class. And the first 2 years she was in my class, there was nothing that happened between us. I learned, what her background was, what her story was. She became active in our singles group. She was asked to join the leadership of the singles ministry. It wasn't me who approached her. It was the coordinator of our singles ministry. And so we began to serve side by side in that capacity. We became good friends. And over time, we started developing feelings for one another. And this is something that I wrestled with, because as the Sunday school teacher, I knew it could only end in one good way. If I get into a relationship with her, we'd have to get married. Otherwise, if it goes bad, it could be problematic. I'd seen that in another youth pastor at a church in St. Louis. And so I prayed hard. Debbie prayed hard, and finally, one weekend, we decided to start a relationship. At that time, we were both in accountability groups. Several of the single women Debbie was a part of that group where they would meet weekly to discuss a book, The Spiritual Disciplines of Christian Life by Donald Whitney. And they would pray, and I was meeting with several guys. And so we felt that in good conscience, we had to share with our accountability groups what was going on. And so I shared with my guys. They were all very encouraging. She shared with the women in her group. They were not encouraging. They were adamantly opposed to this. And so from that point on, we began to pray hard that God would be at work. That He would give us wisdom in knowing how we should relate to each other in a way that would bring honor to Him. That would be a blessing to the other singles. That we would find favor in their eyes, our relationship would find favor. That He would give us wisdom in knowing when it was the right time to make it clear to everyone that we had a relationship. We had to pray this. And the reason is because when we see here in Nehemiah chapter 1, turn here with me. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev. Kislev is November, December. In the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. So at this point, Persia is the dominant power. Nehemiah is serving the royal courts. Jews have gone back to resettle in the land. And so he's asking about the situation. They said to me, those who survived exile are back in the province, are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And his prayer, he basically is confessing the sins of his people before God. Where I want to draw your attention is in verse 10. They are your servants, your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant, and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. Who's this man? It's the king. And then he says, I was cupbearer to the king. So he's saying, God, give me an opportunity that I might be able to talk to the king about this issue, that I might find favor before him. Chapter 2, verse 1. In the month of Nisan, March, April now, several months later, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This is a problem. As a cupbearer, if you are tasting the wine and your face is sad, that's a sign of, it's a red flag for the king. Something is not right. Could it be that he's tasting poison? Could it be that he's the one bringing the poisonous cup, and he's the messenger? And so the king is observing this. He says, there's something not right with you. This can be nothing but sad his heart. So he's very discerning. He recognizes that this is an emotional thing for Nehemiah. I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins, its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it you want? Here's the opportunity. Then I prayed to the God of heaven. And I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah, where my fathers are buried, so that I can rebuild. What's the request? I want to go back and rebuild the walls. Serve as the governor. That's his desire. Then the king with the queen sitting beside him asked me, how long will your journey take, and when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. You see what happened? He prayed. God provided him with opportunity. He moved the king's heart that he found favor with him. And that leads us to the next thing. Even though we should be seeking out God, then we must also take the step of obedience when the opportunity arises. God gives us the wisdom to know what to do, how to act. Look back here in Daniel chapter 1. So Daniel has his opportunity. He brings his request. The chief official makes it very clear. This is his dilemma. Suppose he gives Daniel what he's asking for after 3 years of eating vegetables and drinking water. Daniel and his friends look very haggard, very sickly, very weak. Then what's going to happen? The king is going to look at the chief official and say, you were derelict in your duty. You didn't take care of these guys. You didn't give these guys everything that they needed. And so you know what? What's the punishment? It's your head that's on line. Off with it. You're dead. And so Daniel recognizes, he's sympathetic to this man's plight. And so rather than press the issue, he now goes to the man who is truly over them in terms of serving them the food. And he says, here's an experiment I'd like to run with your permission. He's using tact and humility. Let's take 10 days. You just serve us vegetables and water. At the end of 10 days, then you can evaluate our condition, which is under young men. Because the unstated conclusion is this: if they look weak and ill, then they can start eating the royal food. That 10 days is not going to impact them in any way. It won't ever be seen by the king. But if they look more healthier, then please, let's continue to eat this. And so the official agrees. And this is the thing. When we seek God in prayer, asking for Him to move with His hand for us to find favor, then we must take action in maintaining our conviction, saying, God, I'm trusting in You for the outcome. So I'm going to be obedient to what You've called me to do. What could that be? That could be that it could be at work. Maybe they're doing diversity and inclusion training. And you say, you know what, I don't agree with this. But I recognize my role in this company. And so I'm going to go in there. I'm going to be respectful. I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to dialogue with them. And in that process, I'm going to try to speak biblical truth into the situation as well. I'm going to conduct myself with humility, being respectful towards others, acting with grace, and see what God does. This is what it means to trust the Lord. And what happens in chapter 1 here? We see the result. God allows Daniel and his friends to experience His grace. So at the end of the 10 days, verse 15, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. So how did God bless them? He did it this way. First, after that 10 days, they looked healthier, better nourished. So, for the chief steward over them, he said, okay, that's the proof. We're going to keep feeding you vegetables. Because Daniel and his friends were seeking to honor the Lord, God enabled them to be able to understand what they're learning, to be skilled in how they apply that knowledge. For Daniel, He gave them the ability to understand dreams and interpret that. And we see the rest of Daniel where he does this. He interprets the dream for King Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2, chapter 4. We see where he interprets writing on the wall in chapter 5 when Belshazzar sees a hand appear writing on the wall. We see this. We see when they're tested after 3 years. Nebuchadnezzar finds that they are wiser than all his magicians and enchanters. What are magicians and enchanters? Magicians of Babylonian court were the men who studied the movement of the stars and planets. So to some degree they're astronomers, but they were using that to try to predict the times. They're astrologers. They would, if Nebuchadnezzar was on a campaign, they would go with him and they would read the intestines of an animal and try to figure out what he should do. Or they throw arrows on the ground. The way that they landed, they would try to say, this is what you're supposed to do, O king. The enchanters were those that would use incantations and spells to try to gain knowledge through occultic means. And all of this is forbidden in the law. God was very clear that Israel was not to tolerate witches and sorcerers and necromancers, but rather they were to go to Him for wisdom. And so, we see this. So how does that apply to us? Turn to 1 Samuel chapter 2. 1 Samuel chapter 2. Eli is the high priest over Israel. Samuel is a young boy serving before Eli. Eli has 2 sons, and they show true disdain towards God. Rather than letting an Israelite offer a sacrifice and then taking the portion that belongs to them, they would forcibly take the choicest parts, the parts that belong to God, for themselves. And so a prophet comes and speaks God's judgment to Eli's family. But where I want to look at is in verse 30. Therefore, the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promise that your house and your father's house will minister before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me. Those who honor me, I will honor. But those who despise me will be disdained. And that's the key principle. If we choose to honor the Lord, He in turn honors us in our obedience. So what does that honor look like? It could be like Daniel, where you are prosperous and you're successful. It could be where God honors you by giving you the wisdom and discernment that you need in your decision making. It may mean God gives you the strength to persevere as you're experiencing persecution. Or it could mean that God honors you by allowing you to die so that your death can be used by Him to further His kingdom. We see an example of this. 1954, Jim Elliot, Nate Saint, Roger Daring, Pete Fleming, Ed McCauley. They're missionaries in Ecuador. And they have a burden for the Waodani people, called the Aucas by non-Waodani. They're a violent people group. And every outsider that comes in their territory, they get speared or killed. And they have a burden for them because they want to bring the gospel to them. And so Nate Saint flies his plane over Waodani territory looking for communities. And when he finds a village, he begins to drop a bucket with different gifts. They would put gifts back to him. And this way they could try to show that, hey, we come in peace. And finally, day comes, they find a sandbar close to one of these communities. It's just the right length for him to land his plane. So he lands, they bring in materials, they build a little tree house for them to stay. And finally the day comes when the 5 missionaries are going to meet face to face with Waodani. They come. The first day there's an older woman, a man, and a young woman. And they make contact. They even take the man up and their plane flies over his village. Causes great consternation among the people. And then they think everything is good and they wait for the next day. And what they don't know behind the scenes is this man already has a wife. He wants this young woman as another wife, and that's not right. They have relationships, and people realize what's going to happen. And so he knows that the anger of the tribe is against him. He's going to die. So he turns that anger towards foreigners, saying, hey, those foreigners are misleading us. And so they all rush in a mob frenzy, and they kill the 5 missionaries. So on the outside, we say, how can they have honored God? It ends in death. But that's not the end of the story. Because the Waodani were at a point of killing and revenge killing, another revenge killing where they're going to kill themselves out of existence. And they recognized it. And it was at that point where they realized they needed help. And so they invited Elizabeth Elliot, Jim Elliot's wife, Nate Saint's sister, Rachel Saint, to come and live with them and to bring the words of God to them. And through the process, they all, as a tribe, became believers. We don't know how God is going to honor our obedience. How He chooses to do that is up to Him. It's not up to us. How He conceptualizes it is not based on how we think it's going to be, because He sees the greater picture. And so when we look here in chapter 1, we talk about this issue of, do I compromise or do I stand firm in my conviction? What does that mean for us? It means this: if you don't know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, there's a lot of things that vie for your attention, for your commitment. You could fight for climate change or saving the environment. You can fight for something else. But ultimately, the only thing that matters is Jesus Christ. Because the environment, God's going to change that on His own with the final judgment. He's going to consume this present world with the curse of sin hanging over it with fire. In its place, He's going to have a new heaven and a new earth. War, nuclear proliferation, that's all going to disappear after the final judgment. So what is the answer? The answer is Jesus Christ, because everything starts with the human heart. The heart is more deceitful than anything else. Who can understand it? Yet God understands it. He's provided the means to transform it. And that's Jesus Christ. We admit we're a sinner. We believe in Jesus Christ. We put our faith in Him, and we confess Him. We turn away from our sins, tell others about Jesus Christ. But what does it mean for all of us who have done that? How do we choose to stay firm in our convictions? There's several ways. First, we fear God. What does it mean to fear God? It means we possess an accurate understanding of who He is, who we are, what sin is, what Jesus Christ has done. That's what fearing God is. We live in light of that. That's the foundation. But then we determine what are the non-negotiables. So if we're talking about non-negotiables in a relationship, if you've been in a relationship and someone cheated on you, obviously a non-negotiable is in your next relationship, you don't want someone who's going to cheat on you. You want someone who's going to be faithful. What are non-negotiables for us as believers? Non-negotiable number one. God's created all of us in His image. Therefore, all life is precious, even the unborn. What else? God alone is the true God. He's the ultimate authority. So no other authority can claim our allegiance. That's a non-negotiable. Evaluate everything through the filter of biblical truth. So if we profess to believe that the Bible contains the thoughts and words of God, that there's no error found in it, and it reflects the truth, then we need to identify and critically examine the underlying assumptions and premises of everything that we're hearing from the world around us. What we see in the media, what we get in our schools, what we hear from our politicians. We critically evaluate in light of the truth of God's Word. We need to understand that every aspect of society, it has an agenda. And we recognize and identify what that agenda is. We're intentional in how we relate the gospel to our culture. The youth have been going through a series on worldview, and this past Friday we talked about this, about how we can be intentional in connecting the gospel to where someone is in our culture. Be willing to suffer the consequences for holding to what is true and right and good. Know that there's going to be a backlash. Why? Because a nail that sticks up, it's going to get hammered down. Our culture society does not like this, and that leads us to another one. Understand that our culture is hostile toward God and toward those who represent Him. This world is not our friend. We should not expect it to show us any mercy or favoritism. We've been blessed. For a long time, our society had some exposure to biblical knowledge and biblical values and mores. And there was an agreement there. But we're now living in a time in our culture where that's not the case anymore. And so we should not expect culture to do us any favors. We must understand that God is faithful even if our experiences would seem to point the opposite. So God, I'm trying to be faithful to you, and here I'm experiencing this pain. Where are you? What are you doing? We need to understand that God does not change. There's a false error in theology called process theology. It says that with the problem of evil, God is either all-powerful and is not merciful, so He doesn't deal with evil and suffering in our life, or He's merciful and He's powerless to deal with it. And so they say this powerless God, He loves us, so He's still growing. He's still developing. That's not the God of the Bible. The biblical God does not change. He's the same yesterday, the same tomorrow. He's perfect in every way. And so even if we can't see Him at work, does not mean He's not actively bringing about His purposes. And finally, because of this, we can pray to God with confidence. We go to Him. We lean on Him. So with Eric Liddell, what happened 6 months before the 1924 Olympics, he tells the British Olympic Committee, I'm going to train for the 400-meter race. It's not his main event. It's not an event he's ever trained for. So for 6 months he's trained. People are not expecting great things to happen. The day of Olympics come, 200-meter race, he places third. Respectable. 400-meter semifinals, he wins his heat, but he's a little bit slower than American runner Horatio Finch, the odds-on favorite. And so the day of the finals comes, and they already say, well, you know what, Eric Liddell has several strikes against him. 400-meter race is not his main event. That's not what he normally trains for. He's a sprinter. He's not an endurance runner. He's already run 2 races the last several days. He's pretty wore out. And the American runner, Finch, has outperformed him. There's no way Eric Liddell can do this. The morning of the race, one of the people in the locker room slips him a note and says, the good book says, him who honors me, I will honor. It's quoting from 1 Samuel 2:30, what we just looked at. And so Eric Liddell goes, shakes the hands of all of his competitors, gets ready. He's placed in the outermost lane where he's at a disadvantage, can't see where the other runners are as he's running at the first half of the race. And so the gun goes off, and he takes off like he's running the 100-meter race. And one of his fellow Olympians, sitting in stands, a Jewish man who has the 400 as his main event, looks on and thinks, Eric is a fool. He's going to burn himself out. And all the other runners probably think the same way. The strategy of running off the same pace is going to wear him out. He's going to fade. He's going to lose the race. But then something strange happens. As the race progresses, Eric Liddell begins to run faster and faster, widening the distance until at the end, he sets a new world record. And he's 5 lengths ahead of the next runner. Reporters asked him afterwards, how was this possible? He said, at the first half race, I tried to run as fast as I could. The second half race, God helped me run faster than I could. That's what it is. We maintain our convictions, and God